During the season of Lent, we're preaching this series called From the Wilderness to the Cross, and we're asking you to read through the Gospel of Mark, and we are preaching chronologically. We're not going to preach the whole Gospel, of course, but last week we preached from the first chapter, today from chapter 4, and we'll be moving through the Gospel of Mark. Somebody asked me, why are we reading the Gospel of Mark? And I'll just tell you that, for one thing, I love Mark, but the other reason is that Mark is the briefest gospel and the earliest gospel. We've said this on a number of occasions. So it's kind of like if you decided you wanted to become an expert on Abraham Lincoln or Churchill. You could start, there's this new biography of Churchill I'd like to get to. You could start with a great big 1,000-page tome about Churchill or about Abraham Lincoln. You might be intimidated enough that you say, no, I'm not going to do it at all, or you might try getting through it. You could do it that way. But another way to do it would be to read the shortest, best biography of Churchill and get the framework of his life and then start moving up. And each time you're filling in some more details about his life, and it just gets easier and easier before long. So that's how I recommend reading the New Testament. You read the 16 chapters of Mark, and you say, wow, that wasn't bad at all. And I have a picture of the life of Jesus. Then you can go to Luke, Matthew, and so forth, and you start filling in all the blanks. So that's something for you to try. We hope you'll read Mark. You can read it in one sitting if you want to. Somebody told me today they've already listened to it on audio. Stephanie Reed-Meyer and our staff, if you go to the website, you can listen to it with probably, I don't know how long it is, maybe a 45-minute treadmill workout. You can probably listen to all of Mark. So however you do it, we encourage you to do so. Today we are reading from the 4th chapter of Mark, a story about the disciples. The disciples, you'll see here the disciples being portrayed in not that good a light, and we'll talk about this in a moment. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up, and they said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And this is what he said to the disciples, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" He upbraids them. And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Sooner or later, we all encounter our own humanity, don't we? For instance, I don't know about you, but I think most of us think of ourselves as being kind. And then we'll find this moment where we are incredibly mean or mean-spirited to someone, and we look back and we say, why did I do that? We think of ourselves as being open-minded, and then we walk away from a conversation and we realize that I wasn't even really listening to that person. How prejudicial can a person be? We think of ourselves as being smart, and then we realize we've done something really dumb. I don't know about you, but that happened when I was in college. I thought I was really, really smart. That's when I realized I was really, really dumb. If you look at the things that I did in college and just kind of catalog them, you could look up the word dumb in the dictionary, and my college picture would be there. I mean, you were laughing. A lot of you are baby boomers. You're not going to kid me. Dumb, right? We were pretty dumb in lots of ways. We think of ourselves as being strong, and then we find ourselves in a moment of utter weakness. We think of ourselves as being brave, and suddenly we realize we're cowards. We think of ourselves as being faithful, and then we find a moment or a season where we're filled with doubt and trepidation. Well, that's what happened to these disciples, isn't it? I mean, I think this picture especially, you can really get this picture well when you stop and think about the disciples, who they were and how they were called. You remember most of the disciples, the main ones, the first ones. Jesus is walking along the Sea of Galilee, and he comes upon Peter and Andrew and then James and John. These men are big, tough men. You talk about a man's man. That's who Peter was, right? They were fishermen. They were sailors. And here we are. We find them in their element, right? These are men who know about the water. They know about the sea. They know about boats. They even know a lot about the weather. And so I think about this. They're out there in this boat on the Sea of Galilee, and at the very least, they're thinking, at least here we are competent. We are competent. This is what we do. We know how to sail. We know how to fish. We know how to navigate. We know how to deal with the weather. And suddenly the wind comes up and they find themselves incompetent. They find themselves, though they think of themselves as being brave and courageous, they find themselves scared to death. They think of themselves as being strong, but they find themselves in this moment of weakness. Here they have run straight into their own humanity and encountered their own humanity, and it is not good news. Jesus says, "Why are you so afraid? Have you no faith?" Imagine how bitterly disappointing that must have been to them, especially Peter, who over and over again thought of himself as being so strong, so faithful, so courageous. Why are you so afraid? Have you no faith? Well, we've asked you to read the Gospel of Mark during this season. So let me just say a word about the Gospel of Mark. I'm going to kind of help you understand a particular theme that runs through the Gospel of Mark. I have a friend that talks about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are what we call the three synoptic Gospels. Synoptic, it comes from a German word. We don't really have to fool with the definition of that. It's just to say that the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not John, have a lot of material that is the same. And Mark was the earliest one of the three. So when Luke and Matthew sat down to write their stories about Jesus, they had Mark in front of them. So they have a lot of material that is the same. But they also have a tone and a kind of message and certain prejudices that are unique to each and every one of them. I have a friend who talks about going to the church of Luke or to the church of Matthew or of Mark. You know how there are different churches. There's Christ United Methodist Church, and there's another Methodist church, and there's a third Methodist church, and we're all United Methodists, but we're different in some ways, right? A different culture, different personality, different emphasis. In this church, we put so much emphasis upon children and mission. You figured that out, right? Children and mission over and over again, changing our community. Other churches have other emphases. So that's the way it is with the church of Mark, the church of Luke, the church of Matthew. So I'll just do a brief. When you start reading in the other Gospels quickly, Matthew, when you open up Matthew, Denise preached on the first verses of Matthew the other day. He doesn't go straight to the Christmas story exactly. He goes to the genealogy. There's this whole paragraph. It's kind of boring. It's the genealogy of Jesus starting with Adam and Eve. And why does he do that? Why? It's so boring. Why does he do that? Well, then when you start reading Matthew's version of the Christmas story, he says this over and over again. So this happened in order to fulfill the Old Testament prophecy about Jesus, about the Messiah. So Matthew is doing this because Matthew is a Jew, a Christian Jew writing to Christian Jews. And it's important for him to prove to his audience, his congregation, in his church, that Jesus was the Messiah, the same Messiah that was spoken of in the Hebrew Scripture. Got it? It's really interesting, I think. The Gospels become more interesting if you start looking at these themes. We turn to the Gospel of Luke. A lot of people love Luke because Luke emphasizes the ministry of Jesus to women and to children and to the poor. In other words, to those who had the least standing in the society and culture of that day. So Luke is the one who has great compassion, and he sees He sees a Jesus who ministers with great love and compassion to those who are left out in the society in which they lived. If we go to the church of Mark, now Mark is really interesting because one of the themes you'll see throughout Mark is his negative descriptions of the disciples. Throughout Mark, you'll find Mark describing the disciples as being, they didn't understand it, they're dumb, they're stupid, they couldn't get it, they didn't have much faith. He just describes them in relatively negative terms. I'll give you a hint. If you're reading a book of fiction, do not go to the final chapter and read it, right? It'll run the story for you. But if you're reading nonfiction, it's really a smart thing. Read the introduction and the first chapter, then go to the last chapter and read the last chapter, and then you've got the bookends, and then the story will come together for you better. Guess what you see when you go to the 16th chapter of Mark? The last chapter. It's the story about the resurrection of Jesus. So Jesus has been resurrected, and Jesus comes back to see the disciples. And even the resurrected Jesus, we are told in the 16th chapter, you can look it up, he upbraids the disciples for their lack of faith. Because when the women go to the tomb, they see it's empty, they come back, they tell the disciples they didn't believe. They didn't believe. You see this throughout Mark. And Jesus chews them out even in the final chapter, the 16th chapter. So I want you to understand kind of what to be looking for when you read through Mark. But it raises this question: why is it that Mark speaks about the disciples in such negative terms throughout his gospel? It's a good question, isn't it? Well, guess what? We don't really know the answer. And by that I mean, a lot of people think they know the answers. Different scholars, they disagree. For instance, there are some scholars who believe that this was kind of church politics. That maybe Mark had some rivalry with some other churches, other preachers who were more committed. Church politics in the first century, my God, can you imagine that? That was funny, you can laugh. Church politics. Maybe there's some church politics involved. Maybe there's some various reasons why maybe Mark didn't paint the picture of the disciples in as positive terms as possible. Here's one of the explanations, and this is the one I like. Maybe Mark wanted his readers to know that following Jesus isn't always easy. Maybe Mark wanted you and me to know that the decision to follow Jesus isn't always easy, that we find ourselves failing over and over again. I've said this before. You already know this. The youth choir was here at the 8:45 service. They did a great job. You know, some of them are so young, maybe they haven't discovered this yet, but you have. If you expect life to be easy, you're on a fool's errand. You're on a fool's errand, aren't you? There are times when we get seduced, absolutely, especially when we're younger. There are times when we get seduced. We go through a period where we're really struggling, maybe trying to get through college or graduate school or through that first job, and all of a sudden things fall into place. Maybe you get married, you have children, you buy a house, everything seems to fall in place, and here you are sailing clear skies. You can look, you know exactly where you're navigating. And the skies are clear, and you say, from here on out, life is going to be easy. And then all of a sudden, there are those storm clouds. And it can come from any direction. It can involve anything. It can be personal. It can be about a member of your family. It could be about business. You know all of these stories. And maybe when we're young, we get through that storm, and then we head off and we say, oh, and we get seduced again. We think life's going to be easy from this point out. Clear, everything's clear, and then another storm cloud. And pretty soon, if we're smart, we learn that expecting life to be easy is a fool's errand. Don't get fooled by that. You know, there are certain preachers I really try to be collegial. My colleagues, whether they're Methodist or Baptist or Pentecostal, whatever, I try to think the best about my fellow preachers, no matter who they are, where they are, what their theology is. That's why we have different churches, right? Mark, Matthew, and Luke. We have different churches. Makes sense. But I have some colleagues that I just don't get it. You can turn on the radio or the TV almost any day, and you'll have a preacher pop up there that says, all you got to do is believe in Jesus and get up in the morning and smile really big, and Jesus is going to bless you. Jesus is going to bring you money and wealth and health. You won't have to worry about anything. And we all know that that's a lie. Just because you decide to follow Jesus doesn't mean that Jesus is going to make it easy in your life. And Mark, for sure, was not that kind of preacher. You wouldn't turn on the radio or walk into Mark's sanctuary and find him standing up and saying, all you got to do is believe in Jesus and everything's going to be easy from here on out. Mark said just the opposite. You're going to try as hard as you can to be faithful. You're going to think you're smart and brave and courageous and all of those things, but it doesn't make any difference. You're still going to run into storms in your life. And you're going to look back and say, how could I have been so stupid? Or how could I have been so skeptical? How could I have been so doubting about what it is that Jesus is doing in my life? Mark would stand up in his pulpit and say, let me tell you this. If you decide to follow Jesus, it isn't necessarily going to be easy. And you're going to run into one storm after another, and life can get really, really hard. But I want you to know this. You'll still be following someone who will be right there in the boat with you and who has the power to tame the storms that threaten to destroy you.